The river ran dark under the Anatolian sun, its waters cold and fast with the spring melt, and on its far bank an army stretched like an iron wall across the hills. Horses pawed the ground, armor gleamed, and Persian banners caught the wind in a riot of color. The satraps of Asia Minor gathered in a single host, determined to crush a young invader before his legend could even begin. The Granicus River was no ordinary stream. On this day it would become the threshold between two worlds, the dying grandeur of Persia's western dominions and the blazing dawn of Macedonian conquest. And standing at the heart of it all was a man barely 22 years old, a king whose name would one day echo through every corner of the known world, Alexander. But in the spring of 334 BC he was still untested, still the son of Philip, rather than the conqueror of Persia. Before him waited tens of thousands of warriors determined to halt his advance, to end his story before it began. Could he cross this river, or would his ambitions drown in its rushing current? The invasion of Asia was more than a campaign. It was the culmination of decades of Macedonian preparation. Alexander's father, Philip II, had dreamed of leading the Greeks against Persia, not simply for glory, but for revenge. Memories of the Greco-Persian Wars still burned in Greek hearts. Stories of Thermopylae, Salamis, and Marathon carried down through generations as both inspiration and grievance. Now Philip was gone, cut down by an assassin's blade in the prime of his power, and his son had taken the throne under whispers that he was too young, too reckless, too untried to command an empire. Yet Alexander inherited not only Philip's throne, but also his plan: to carry war eastward, to strike the Persian Empire at its richest edges, and to show the world that Greece could no longer be threatened by the monarchs of Asia. The army that followed Alexander was not vast by Persian standards, perhaps 47,000 souls, hardened veterans of Philip's wars and younger men eager to test themselves under the new king. It was a coalition of Macedonians and Greeks, infantry and cavalry, forged into a professional force unlike any the world had yet seen. The phalanx with its bristling pikes, the companion cavalry that fought as an extension of the king himself, and mercenary hoplites whose loyalty was bought with Persian gold, but now pointed westward in defiance. All these formed the spear that Alexander would thrust into Asia. Behind them stretched supply lines, ships, and fragile alliances. Ahead of them lay the Persian satrapies, wealthy, well-defended, and commanded by men who had everything to lose. For the Persians, this invasion was both insult and danger. The great King Darius III had only recently secured his throne after years of upheaval. To allow a young Macedonian to stride unchecked into Asia would show weakness to the provinces and invite rebellion. And so the satraps of Asia Minor gathered their strength, pooling cavalry from the plains and infantry from the cities. They chose their ground carefully, knowing the invaders must cross rivers and mountains, hoping to halt them at the first opportunity and send Alexander AS head back to Darius as proof of Persia's might. The Granicus was chosen as that place of reckoning, its swift current and steep banks a natural barrier behind which the Persian cavalry arrayed itself in glittering ranks. The encounter was inevitable. Alexander's advance through the Hellespont had been bold, steeped in symbolism. At Troy, he had sacrificed to Achilles, calling upon the shade of his heroic ancestor to witness his deeds. To his men, this was more than war. It was myth reborn, the Iliad come alive upon Asian soil. The king himself played the role of Achilles, young, daring, hungry for glory. And just as the Greek heroes had fought for Kleos, everlasting fame, so too would Alexander measure his life by the battles he endured and the victories he won. Fate, it seemed, had drawn him to this very river. To retreat was impossible, to hesitate unthinkable. The gods would judge him here and the world would watch. As the Macedonians marched toward the Granicus, tension rippled through the ranks. Scouts reported the mass of Persian cavalry waiting across the water, their armor gleaming beneath the sun. For the infantry, the river promised chaos, shields dragged by the current, formations broken, arrows raining down from the far bank. For the cavalry, it meant plunging into deep, rushing water only to emerge upon hostile ground against an enemy ready to strike. Every soldier knew the risk. A single misstep could turn the invasion into catastrophe. a disaster remembered as another failed attempt of Greeks to humble the empire of Asia. Yet Alexander's spirit was unshaken. He rode among his men, a figure of energy and confidence, his horse Bucephalus bearing him proudly, as though both beast and rider sensed destiny pressing upon them. His officers debated strategy. Parmenion, the cautious veteran, counseled delay until morning, when the river might be crossed under less peril. But the king would not hear of it. To wait was to give the Persians courage, to invite hesitation. To strike now, boldly, in the full glare of the sun, would be to seize the initiative and prove before all that no obstacle, neither river nor empire, could bar his way. And so he gave the order. They would fight that very day at that very hour. Thus the stage was set, two armies staring at one another across the rushing Granicus, the future of empires poised upon the brink. The Persians believed their position unassailable. The Macedonians trusted their king. Between them flowed the river that would soon run red with blood. The clash to come would decide not only the fate of Alexander's campaign, but the course of history itself. And as the first lines of Macedonian cavalry edged toward the riverbank, as Persian archers nocked their arrows and satraps readied their charges, the silence of expectation broke into the roar of battle, and the world held its breath for the crossing that would define the beginning of Alexander's conquest of Asia. The Macedonian line began to move, hooves striking the earth in steady rhythm, as cavalrymen tightened their grips upon spears and shields. The river foamed before them, its currents twisting and pulling, as though nature itself resisted their advance. From the far bank, Persian war cries rose like thunder, a wall of sound meant to break the resolve of the men about to plunge into the torrent. Yet Alexander did not falter. He placed himself at the head of his companion cavalry, the wedge of shock troops that would pierce the enemy ranks. Their king rode first, and where he went, the army would follow. The charge began with a burst of energy, horse and rider plunging into the cold embrace of the Granicus. Water splashed high, shields were dragged by the current, and the perfect lines of Macedonian cavalry broke into uneven ranks as they fought against the river's pull. Arrows hissed down from the Persian bank, some striking flesh, others clattering off bronze helmets and wooden shields. The men pressed forward grimly, urged on by the sight of Alexander himself, his plumed helmet shining, his lance leveled toward the enemy. He was no distant commander but the spear point of the attack, urging Bucephalus through the rushing waters, calling his men forward with a voice that rang above the tumult. The Persians had chosen their ground well. Their cavalry crowded the bank, forming a wall of men and horses ready to meet the invaders as soon as they emerged from the water. As the first Macedonians struggled onto the slippery shore, they were struck with fury. Persian noble horsemen, armored in scale and armed with javelins and spears, crashed into them with the advantage of height and momentum. Horses stumbled on wet stones, men slipped, and the river became a killing ground. Still more and more Macedonians pressed forward, climbing from the water with determination carved into their faces. The battle swirled into a chaos of splashing hooves, shattered lances, and cries of pain. In the midst of this storm rode Alexander. He led not from behind but at the very center of the struggle, hurling himself against the Persian cavalry with reckless courage. His lance struck true again and again, piercing armor, casting men from their saddles, driving the enemy back foot by foot. Yet for all his daring, the danger was immense. Surrounded by Persian nobles who recognized him instantly, Alexander became the focus of their fury. They knew that to kill the Macedonian king was to end the invasion in a single stroke. Lances thrust toward him, swords flashed, and his horse reared as the press of enemies closed in. In that desperate moment, death reached for him. A Persian noble named Spithridates, brother of the satrap of Lydia, charged directly at Alexander, his spear striking the king's helmet with such force that the bronze split and Alexander reeled in his saddle. As the young king struggled to regain his senses, Spithridates raised his weapon again for the killing blow. The riverbank seemed to hold its breath. Macedonian hopes trembled upon the edge of ruin. But fate, or perhaps the gods themselves, intervened. Clytus the Black, one of Alexander's companions, struck at the last instant, severing Spithridates' arm with a single sweep of his sword. The Persian's weapon fell harmlessly, and Alexander, regaining himself, drove his spear through his assailant, casting him lifeless to the ground. The moment electrified the Macedonians. Their king had stood on the brink of death and survived, saved by loyalty and courage. With renewed ferocity, they pressed forward, their formation regaining shape even in the chaos of the river crossing. The phalanx, slow to emerge but unstoppable once formed, began to push across, its wall of spears bristling like the teeth of a monstrous beast. Persian cavalry found themselves forced back from the bank, their advantage slipping as the Macedonian tide surged upon them. Still, the Persians fought with stubborn pride. Noble horsemen wheeled and charged, hurling themselves into the melee, their gold and silver armor glinting even as blood stained the earth. For them this was no mere skirmish, but the defense of their homes, their lands, and the authority of the great king. Each clash of steel echoed with the weight of empire. But Alexander's men, hardened veterans of Philip's wars, refused to yield. They had been drilled to fight as one, to follow their king into the very mouth of danger, and now they proved it with every thrust and cry. The battle raged with a fury that defied order. Horses screamed, men were trampled beneath hooves, and the river itself ran red as the dead were swept away by the current. Yet amid the carnage, Alexander's wedge pressed deeper, splitting the Persian cavalry, driving them back step by step. The young king was everywhere, his white-plumed helmet visible above the melee, his voice carrying through the tumult, his spear flashing with each thrust. To his men he seemed untouchable, a figure chosen by destiny, and in their hearts grew the conviction that nothing could stop them so long as he led. Gradually the tide turned. The Persian front wavered under the relentless push, and the cohesion of their cavalry began to break. Some fell back toward the hills, others scattered, leaving gaps that the Macedonians exploited with merciless precision. The phalanx pressed across the river in greater numbers, their sarissas leveling against any who dared resist. What had begun as a desperate gamble upon hostile ground transformed into a rolling advance, the Macedonian machine grinding forward with unstoppable force. Yet even in their retreat, the Persians did not collapse entirely. Many fought to the death, nobles refusing to yield, preferring to fall upon the field rather than bear the shame of defeat. Their valor was undeniable, but valor alone could not withstand the discipline and ferocity of Alexander's army. As the last organized resistance gave way, the satraps themselves withdrew, their plans shattered, their hopes drowned in the waters of the Granicus. When at last the clash subsided, the riverbank lay strewn with the fallen, both Persian and Macedonian. The cries of the wounded mingled with the rushing current, and the air reeked of sweat, blood, and trampled earth. Alexander dismounted, his armor dented, his helmet scarred from the blow that had nearly ended him, yet his spirit unbroken. Around him his men gathered, battered but victorious, their eyes alight with the knowledge that they had achieved the impossible. Against all odds they had crossed the river, smashed the Persian host, and secured the first great victory of the campaign. The legend of Alexander had begun not in safety or caution, but in daring, at the very edge of death, and it had been won by courage, discipline, and the bond between a king and his companions. But victory was only the beginning. Ahead lay the satrapies of Asia Minor, rich cities with walls and garrisons, territories that would not yield simply because one battle had been lost. Behind them lay Greece, watching to see whether Alexander would prove himself the heir of Philip or the reckless youth some had whispered he was. The Granicus was a triumph, but it was also a test, and its outcome promised both glory and greater dangers yet to come. When the din of battle faded, and the last cries of resistance were swallowed by the rushing river, the field of the Granicus revealed its grim harvest. The banks were heaped with bodies, Persian nobles strewn in glittering ruin, their finery now stained with blood and mud. Horses pierced by spears lay collapsed in tangled heaps. The river itself, indifferent to glory or despair, carried the fallen downstream, mingling blood with water as it had carried pebbles for millennia. For Alexander and his men, the victory was absolute, but its cost was not light. Macedonian dead and wounded marked the price of daring, a sobering reminder that the campaign had only just begun. Alexander moved among the fallen with solemnity, his youthful face hardened by the reality of war. The scar on his helmet where Spithridates had struck him was already becoming a symbol among his men. a reminder of how close fate had come to cutting short his life. To them, the survival of their king was nothing less than divine providence. Whispers spread that Athena herself had shielded him, or that Achilles had stood invisibly at his side. For soldiers who saw their king not merely as commander, but as a living embodiment of destiny, such stories were more than rumor. They were truth, woven into the fabric of legend. Yet even in triumph, Alexander understood that victory was not measured only in bodies slain. The Persians had been driven from the field, but Persia itself still loomed vast and unbroken. His next step would determine whether Asia Minor crumbled before him or rose in renewed defiance. And so, amid the spoils and sorrows of battle, Alexander made decisions that revealed not only his ruthlessness, but also his keen sense of political theater. The Persian satraps who had escaped carried their shattered forces eastward, but many Greek mercenaries who had fought for Persia were captured on the field. These men, fellow Hellenes, had sold their swords to the great king, turning against their own kin for Persian gold. To Alexander, they embodied treachery against the cause of Greece, against the pan-Hellenic crusade proclaimed by his father. Their fate was swift and merciless. Thousands were cut down where they stood, a grim warning that betrayal would be met with death. Yet not all were slain. Some were sent in chains to Macedonia, condemned to labor as slaves in the mines. Their fate a spectacle meant to remind the Greek world that Alexander was both avenger and judge. It was a harsh decision, but one calculated to consolidate his authority and to cloak his campaign in the language of justice, not mere ambition. By contrast, the Persian dead of noble birth were treated with an odd respect. Alexander ordered their bodies returned to their families, ensuring burial rites according to custom. To some, this was magnanimity. To others, a shrewd gesture designed to win goodwill among those who had survived. He understood that Persia was not conquered by the sword alone, but also by symbols, by gestures that could sow loyalty where fear might only harden resistance. Each act was part of a larger performance, one in which Alexander cast himself not as destroyer, but as rightful master, the heir to both Greek vengeance and Persian continuity. The news of the victory spread swiftly through Asia Minor. To the Greek cities long under Persian control, the fall of the satrapal army was a signal that liberation had arrived. Alexander entered these cities not as a pillaging conqueror, but as a herald of freedom ordering democratic governments to be established in place of oligarchies loyal to Persia. The rhetoric was powerful. Greece was reclaiming its brothers, casting off the chains of foreign domination. But behind the lofty words lay a calculated strategy. By presenting himself as liberator, Alexander ensured that the cities opened their gates willingly, sparing him long sieges and conserving his strength for greater challenges ahead. Those who resisted, however, would find no mercy, for liberation was a mask that concealed the iron hand of conquest. The Persians, meanwhile, reeled from the shock. Never before had a force so small and so foreign pierced their defenses with such audacity. The satraps had believed the river an unassailable line, their cavalry the finest in the empire, their numbers sufficient to crush a boy king barely ascended to his throne. Instead, they had been driven back in disarray, their prestige shattered, their authority undermined. Darius III, far away in the heartland of Persia, now faced a truth that could no longer be ignored. The Macedonian threat was real, and it was growing with every victory. For Alexander, the Granicus was more than a battlefield triumph. It was a stage upon which he announced himself to the world as a commander of genius and a figure of destiny. The risks he had taken, attacking across the river, placing himself at the very front of the charge, were the acts of a man who believed he was more than mortal. His survival, his ability to turn chaos into victory, and his immediate use of that victory to reshape the political landscape revealed a fusion of warrior and statesman rare in any age. He was not merely winning battles, he was shaping narratives, crafting an image that would endure long after the dead of Granicus had been forgotten. As the army moved deeper into Asia, leaving behind the bloodied banks of the river, the men carried with them a new confidence. They had seen their king face death and emerge victorious. They had crossed what seemed uncrossable, broken what seemed unbreakable. To them, no barrier now seemed insurmountable. Each step eastward was taken not with hesitation, but with a sense of inevitability, as though the world itself were unfolding to meet Alexander's advance. Yet even in triumph, shadows lingered. The brutality shown to the Greek mercenaries left a bitter taste among some, raising questions about whether Alexander's cause was truly one of liberation or domination cloaked in noble words. And the Persian Empire, though wounded, was far from broken. Ahead lay cities of immense wealth, fortresses of stone, armies far larger than the one defeated at the Granicus. The battle had been a beginning, but beginnings are fragile things, easily overturned by the weight of the challenges that follow. For Alexander, the greatest tests still awaited, and the gods who had spared him once might not always intervene. As the Macedonian host marched east, banners fluttering against the Anatolian sky, the echoes of the Granicus faded behind them, replaced by new whispers of destiny. The first strike had been delivered, sharp and stunning, but the war for Persia had only just begun. The dust of battle had scarcely settled when Alexander set about transforming victory into permanence. He knew that wars were not won by single battles, however glorious. A commander who failed to follow triumph with control would find his victories hollow, undone by the slow erosion of supply, loyalty, and legitimacy. And so, as the Macedonian army pressed deeper into Asia Minor, Alexander wove together force and symbolism, steel and spectacle, to ensure that the Granicus was remembered not as a single triumph but as the dawn of a new order. At every city he entered, Alexander staged himself not as foreign invader, but as liberator. In Greek poleis, long subject to Persian rule, he proclaimed the restoration of democracy, expelling oligarchs appointed by the great king and installing governments loyal to him under the banner of freedom. Yet this freedom was carefully bounded. Taxes once paid to Persia now filled Alexander's coffers, and garrisons of Macedonian troops ensured obedience to the new arrangement. The cities hailed him as champion, festivals were held in his honor, and statues erected. But beneath the veneer of liberation lay the iron reality of conquest. Alexander's genius lay in making both realities true at once. He was a conqueror who came with chains, and yet those chains were accepted as garlands of freedom. The memory of Troy hung over all these movements. Before the Granicus, Alexander had paid homage at the supposed tomb of Achilles. To his men, these gestures were more than play-acting. They were proof that their king was bound to a lineage of heroes, that his campaign was no mere struggle for territory, but a continuation of epic destiny. After the victory, stories spread like wildfire that Achilles had aided him at the river, that gods had turned their gaze upon the Macedonian youth and found him worthy. Alexander encouraged these whispers. He dressed not only as a Macedonian king, but with touches of divine imagery, his plumed helmet glinting like the crest of a god of war, his cloak flowing like that of a figure from Homeric verse. In a world where myth and history blurred, such images carried as much weight as victories won with spear and sword. The Persians, too, felt the shifting of reality. Word of the Granicus spread across Asia Minor, carried on the tongues of refugees and merchants, whispered in the halls of satraps and the courts of local rulers. Many who had once bent knee to the great king now wondered whether Persia could truly protect them. The invincibility of the empire had cracked, and through that crack Alexander thrust his image like a blade. He demanded oaths of loyalty, and many gave them not merely out of fear but from calculation, sensing that the tide of fortune was already turning eastward with the Macedonian host. Those who resisted were crushed, their fates made public as warnings. Those who submitted were rewarded with gestures of respect and the promise of continued prosperity. By wielding both terror and clemency, Alexander reshaped the political map without fighting a battle for every city. The psychological effect on his own men was just as profound. Soldiers who had once doubted the wisdom of crossing the Hellespont now walked with renewed pride. Their doubts burned away in the fire of victory. They had faced the Persian cavalry at its strongest and lived. They had seen their king in the thick of combat, bleeding, fighting, surviving, and they believed more firmly than ever that he was touched by fate. Veterans compared him to Philip, but whispered that the son might even surpass the father. Younger soldiers looked upon him with awe, ready to follow wherever he might lead. The bond between king and army, already strong, was now welded into something unbreakable. The Granicus was not merely a test of arms, it was a covenant of destiny, binding Alexander and his men together in a shared faith that nothing could stand against them. Yet Alexander did not allow this faith to rest idle. He constantly reminded his followers of the stakes, speaking of Greece's vengeance against Persia, of the humiliation of Xerxes' invasion generations before. He told them they were writing a new Iliad, with their names destined for immortal remembrance. Every feast, every sacrifice, every public gesture reinforced the idea that they were not merely soldiers, but instruments of history. Even as they marched through the unfamiliar lands of Asia, the men felt themselves participants in a story greater than themselves, their hardships ennobled by the thought that they were building something eternal. Among the Persians, fear mingled with disbelief. Many had dismissed Alexander as a reckless boy king, but his audacity and the speed of his advance forced them to reconsider. The satraps whispered blame upon one another, and Darius in the distant east began to understand that this was no raid to be repelled, but a war that threatened the heart of his empire. The psychological balance had shifted. No longer was Persia the unassailable giant, and Greece the restless aggressor. Now it was Persia that scrambled to respond, Persia that sought to understand the storm gathering at its gates. In this new landscape of perception, Alexander thrived. He understood that conquest was as much about belief as about armies. By cultivating his image, by ensuring that stories of his daring and divine favor spread faster than his troops could march, he conquered minds even before he conquered walls. The Battle of the Granicus had been won with steel, but its aftermath was won with narrative, and Alexander wielded narrative as deftly as he wielded the spear. As spring deepened into summer, the young king pressed on into the satrapies of Asia Minor, his army a moving tide of discipline and energy. Each city taken, each ruler subdued, was another step along the path blazed at the Granicus. And though greater battles lay ahead, though the might of Persia would rally again in fields far more vast, the memory of the river crossing lingered in every campfire tale, in every whispered rumor. It was the moment when a boy became a conqueror, when an army became a legend, when an empire first trembled at the name of Alexander. And as the horizon beckoned, the Granicus faded behind them, not as an ending, but as a beginning, a threshold crossed not only in geography but in destiny. Ahead lay Gordium, Issus, and Gaugamela, the crucibles of empire. But the spark that lit the fire of conquest, the moment that transformed ambition into inevitability, would always be remembered on the banks of that Anatolian river where steel met water and a legend was born. In the months after the battle, the banks of the Granicus grew silent again. Grass pushed through the trampled earth, and the river washed clean the blood that had once stained its waters. Yet though nature healed, history did not forget. For those who had fought there, the crossing was burned into memory, a vision of chaos and courage that defined the rest of their lives. For those who heard of it in distant lands, the battle became something larger than itself, a symbol that a new age had begun, an age shaped by a young king whose ambition reached further than any who had come before. Alexander himself changed in the aftermath. No longer was he merely Philip's heir, fighting to secure his father's dream. At the Granicus, he had carved out his own destiny, stamped his name into the story of the world. He had shown not only that he could command, but that he could dare, that he could gamble everything on a single throw and emerge victorious. In the eyes of his men and his enemies alike, he became something more than a mortal general. He became the man whom fate seemed to favor, the figure whose life already blurred with myth. Every future battle would be measured against the Granicus, every decision weighed by the daring that had brought him through its waters. The consequences spread far beyond the battlefield. Asia Minor, once a secure western shield for the Persian Empire, began to unravel. Satraps who had fled the field found their authority questioned, their subjects no longer certain of Persian protection. Cities that had once paid tribute to Darius now opened their gates to Alexander, some willingly, others compelled, but all recognizing that the balance of power had shifted. In less than a year, the western provinces of the empire, territories that had been Persian for generations, slipped into Macedonian hands. The first strike had not only bloodied Persia, it had cut deep into its body, severing vital limbs and exposing the heart to further blows. For the Greek world, the victory carried its own meanings. Those who had doubted Alexander, who had whispered that a boy could not command where Philip had triumphed, now fell silent. The Pan-Hellenic crusade against Persia, once a political slogan, now had flesh and bone. Alexander was not only avenging Greece, but expanding it, carrying the banners of the Hellenes across the sea and into the storied lands of Asia. Even those who had resisted him at home began to cloak themselves in his reflected glory, proud to call him one of their own. In this way, the Granicus did not merely humble Persia, it united Greece more firmly under Macedonian leadership, binding city-states to a destiny they could no longer deny. Yet the deepest legacy of the Granicus was neither political nor military, but symbolic. In that reckless charge across the river, Alexander had embodied a vision of leadership that was at once inspiring and dangerous. He was a king who shared the risks of his men, who rode at the front, whose life was placed upon the edge of every sword. To his soldiers, this made him a hero worthy of Homeric verse. To his enemies, it made him a figure of dread, for how could one defeat an army led by a man who seemed to court death and yet always escape it? The near-fatal blow struck by Spithridates, the miraculous rescue by Clitus, the scar that Alexander carried afterward, all became part of a story larger than fact, a story in which destiny itself rode beside him into battle. But such a vision carried shadows as well. The very qualities that made Alexander invincible in the eyes of his men, his daring, his belief in his own fate, his willingness to risk all, were the same that could one day drive him to excess, to gambles even greater and more perilous than the Granicus. For now, however, those shadows were distant. In the spring light of 334 BC, Alexander stood at the threshold of empire, his path eastward open, his enemies shaken, his legend rising with every mile. The Persian Empire, vast though it remained, had been struck by a truth it could not ignore. The boy from Macedon was no passing raider, but a storm that would not be contained. The satraps had failed, the western defenses had crumbled, and Darius himself would be forced to take the field. The stage was set for greater battles, at Issus, at Gaugamela, at the gates of Persia itself. But each of those battles, no matter how vast, would carry within them the echo of the Granicus, the first clash that showed the world who Alexander was and what he would become. For in the end, the Granicus was more than a victory. It was an announcement, a thunderclap at the edge of Asia, declaring that a new power had risen, that the world was about to be remade. The river that once marked the border of empires became the river of beginnings, the place where ambition crossed into destiny, where a young king stepped out of the shadow of his father and into the blinding light of history. And as his army marched ever deeper into Persia, banners snapping in the wind, songs rising around campfires, and stories of divine favor spreading from village to village, one truth became inescapable. The crossing of the Granicus was not the end of anything, but the beginning of everything.